Welcome to our second September developer call for Urbit, wherein we will be talking about communal computing and the Internet of Things and building a sovereign smart home with pilwyc-fastec. Pilwyc has been studying how Urbit and IoT devices complement each other and some of the concerns around security and ownership and how this impinges with ideas that we have about external or embodied cognition and various things that we have in our environment. Has a background in product management, in building B2C and B2B products, apps, and services. I don't actually know offhand what B2C and B2B are, so that will fall to you, Pilwyc.
Well, there's also B2B to C, which I'm not specialized in, so we can talk about that.
This is monstrous. So yeah, welcome for thanks for coming on and talking to us about this. You had a blog post recently that outlined some of the conclusions and recommendations and thoughts that you'd had up to this point. Anything you want to say to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for having me on. I mean, I definitely there's a lot of things that I've been thinking about when it comes to the smart home, and I actually just did this talk over at Reassembly, and so I think there's a lot of problems with at least so through the grant, right? Like the whole grant, and maybe it would help if I put up some slides just temporarily so we can talk through the grant. But essentially, this grant was really just to learn more about how people think about Urbit in the home, and in particular, how do people think about their identities within Urbit? Because I guess from the standpoint of communal computing, and maybe like some definitions are helpful here, but communal computing is really about the idea that in homes, in offices, in kind of shared spaces, we end up using our identities to interact with software or services. And one of those problems ends up being that, like, so when we're in the home, right, we will use something like a smart light bulb. And the way that people interact with this, has to be through an app or through some other type of interface. Ideally, it's a switch, right? That's the way that traditional light bulbs would work. But basically how we, so like I live at home with my wife and kids and my mother-in-law, who, is with us like 5 days a week to help with the kids. We all have to interact with these smart home devices. And when interviewing people within Urbit, we talked a lot about how they start to consider their identities not only by themselves, but also with the people that they live with. And so I think this goes all the way back to the idea of even, the idea of shared or time sharing within mainframes, right? Like really the reason why all this started was because of the fact that in a research and development standpoint, people had to use computers together, right? And so if you had to like walk up and provide a bunch of like, punch cards to a device and file and basically have them loaded into the computer, there was like a physicality of it, right? There was someone in front of the device that was actually using it. Once you started to have like a server client architecture, it could be anybody in the building, it could be anybody that was connected over the internet that could be using this device. And so we started to have to add identities to who's currently using the device, the computer, who's actually using the resources that are here. And we had to start doing things like scheduling, had to start to like, maybe shut down jobs that were going too long, things like that. And all the way, fast forward to like the time that the Amazon Echo came out, we were perfectly fine using laptops or mobile phones that were very personal. But the kind of public computer that was in your living room went away, right? Like people started to use their own personal devices much more. But when the Amazon Echo came out in like 2013, we now had to reintroduce this idea of, okay, well, someone's still logged into this device, but who is it? And that gets very tricky when not everybody wants to have an identity on a device, right? But everybody has to interact with it. I mean, and definitely, I think like the weird side effect of a lot of these things ends up being that, my Spotify playlist, for example, is totally screwed up because my kids are constantly playing like Minecraft music. on the shared device that's in our kitchen.
Yes.
And that is a thing, by the way, Minecraft music. But I think, that's where things get really tricky about identity, is that who is actually using this device, whose behavioral information is being streamed to a third party. And then, in the case of Urbit, some people were concerned about this, some people were not. And we can talk about like kind of how I see the segmentation of that. But really this entire grant was about the idea of like, how do we actually think about the smart home and where could Urbit be within that space?
Well,
so yeah, that's kind of the beginning.
I remember back in the 90s when Bill Gates built a smart home originally.
Yeah.
This was very, there were articles about this, and it was
he had like a badge system where it would like,
right, it was a badge system where it would detect like proximity, like was there someone in the room, did it time out on the room, and right. Obviously for several reasons we didn't go with something like an RFID badge, but that did sort of have a baked in separate user identity system.
It did, yeah.
Whereas now with the mass data harvesting and so forth that goes on, like for my children, in cases where I do have to have a separate account for them for purposes of convenience or whatever, it's just named Child Davis.
Exactly.
And
but that's the problem though. Like the solution, the solution is not fast user switching, right? Like, which is that who is actually in front of this device. It's not just me or my wife or my kids, like it's all of us. Right. And I think that's the problem that I think is very unique, is that our identities actually have a lot to do with our interdependent relationships within the home. And so it's not, I think that's the problem, is like, even if we had a badging system, even if I wanted to badge my kids as they walk around, like it's hard enough to keep a leash on them, let alone a badge. But like, even if I wanted to do something like that, it's still not just about them in front of the device, right? It's like the idea of the TV, right? Nielsen has tried to deal with this problem for a very long time, where they're constantly asking the question, like, who's actually watching the show, right? And it could be everybody in the household. And there's a lot of really interesting implications that come out of this when it comes to recommendation systems, like how, like group recommender research is something that, it seems to have happened from like 2000 to 2013, and then just kind of like drops off. But there's a real issue that it's not just about single identities, right? It's actually all of us, and it's whoever could also be in that room. So it's not even the people that could be badged, right? Like it could be people like house cleaners, plumbers. You can even talk about the idea that just outside your home, there's still like a question of identity, like with video doorbells, right? Like, should the UPS driver have an identity in your home, right? And let's go to the extreme, right? Like the most distrusted user in your home is the burglar, right? Should they have an identity in your home? And so I think that's the problem, right? Is that there is this fuzziness around identity. Now, Urbit has very strong identity kind of concepts. It has very weak, in my opinion, like reputation concepts, which I think are good. And that was part of that article that I wrote for the Urbit blog. But I think that's the problem we start to get into, is like, it's actually a lot about how we have interdependent relationships. And there are some cases where that interdependent relationship does not deserve an identity in the home. And yeah, so that's, I think, like a really interesting problem, even for the idea of like the perfect Bill Gates home, was that he still had to badge people when they walked into his home. And that's like, one, awkward, but two, it's like for the people that are just kind of there temporarily, like, should they have an identity in that home, or should they just be like guests, right? And we should have different assumptions.
Comments for all of them.
Exactly. Well, and I think that's a really good point, right? Is like, if you think about the idea of like Urbit as like a heritage computer, like long term, maybe planets end up becoming more exclusive over time because of the like scarcity of them. So then it's like moons, and then everybody in my family has moons. But then, yeah, to your point, like, should we have lots of throwaway comets for people that are just like randomly walking in? When should someone actually opt into having an identity? And I think this gets to like self-sovereignty, where there was some interesting responses from people where in some cases they're like, yes, I believe I should have self-sovereignty in my home around data. But then for everybody else, like, they don't deserve self-sovereignty. And so there's this weird like paradox about like sovereignty of identity. Like, I almost feel like if we were to create the perfect video doorbell, it should actually block people's identities until they opt in. And so, maybe they shouldn't actually have, like, they shouldn't have a comment unless they want to opt in. So I don't know. This is like a really interesting discussion to me, but it's like, how do you decide who controls these identities, right?
Well,
yeah,
there's kind of a Heideggerian critique that you could make here about the classical way in which we've constructed computing identities has been heavily built around a prescriptive model where we have this notion of a discrete user one at a time with an associated set of delegated permissions and authorities in the system. But what we want is actually not a prescriptive, but a descriptive system where, to some extent, identity is what you do.
Yeah, that's fair.
Within the given context.
Well, and to your point, I mean, like, it's the idea of
emergent.
Yeah, the idea of like the smart home device in the kitchen, right, actually represents the kitchen. And it could be anybody that goes in there. And so in some cases it's me, sometimes it's my wife, sometimes it's me, my wife, and my kids, right, listening to music or something like that. But it could also be, you know, someone's just temporarily there, like a house cleaner. And so I don't know, I mean, like, the context of the traditional, like, who, what, when, where, why, and how types of questions really become important. And I mean, there's something I reference in the white paper that was a result of this grant, which is basically contextual integrity, which is a privacy kind of framework or theory that what matters is the flow of information and the way that people control that. And so it ends up being like, who is the sender and who's the receiver, who's the subject, what's the kind of domain or norms that are associated with that. And so in the case of the kitchen, right, like, people have to in some way enter the home, right? Like, the only thing that we really lock inside of homes ends up being like the front door. It ends up being maybe a safe, right? And that's really it. Like, everything else is dictated by norms. Like, the fact that there's a closed door actually tells someone not to come in or to knock.
You better lock that bathroom door. That's what I've learned.
Well, yeah, if you have kids, like, it changes everything. But those norms change over time too, right? Like it is like understandable that, like, my 5-year-old will just barge into the bathroom. But if that person is a teenager, that's a very different set of expectations and norms, right? and so, like, I think that's why, like, the idea of rooms as places as context, location is important, because, you know, I have like a basement office, and that basement office could also be a guest room. It could be a place like a storage area, and it could be an office. And it depends on who's there, what time of day it is, what day of the week. And so I think, like, the kitchen is like an interesting case, because it could be like, this is where we're feeding the baby right now, versus the idea of, like, we're having a dinner party, right? And so the context really matters a lot. And then the norms around that end up being like, when I have a dinner party over, do people expect to be recorded? Right? And then the video recording of this dinner party is, like, stored somewhere. And I would argue that no, they don't, right? Like, when they come into your home, they may have some expectations of, like, surveillance, but overall, like, I think a lot of these identity things end up coming down to, like, surveillance ends up being like power over versus power to. And same thing with, like, coercion through, like, ad platform type of things. And so anyways, I think these are, like, really interesting questions, is like, what are people's expectations? Like, do they have to sign a waiver at the door that they're going to be recorded? And probably not, is the way that most people run their dinner parties, right? Like, yeah.
Hot society.
Exactly.
Okay, so one of the things that occurs to me is we're thinking about how devices manage context within a home. So part of the evolution of interior architecture, over the past century, has been from having rooms that are designated for particular purposes, but the furniture and the appliances that make them realize that identity were not part of the home for a long time. You had a standalone stove unit. You had tables that you would bring instead of built-in counters. And the trend has been to embed these things physically in the home more and more as time goes on.
Yeah.
Right. A kitchen now has it has, at a minimum, it has a slot for an oven. Very possibly, I don't know if this is, very extremely contemporary, but at least starting in the 1980s, 1990s, you started to see more and more of people installing multiple ovens into the house. And then there was this interplay with, well, what happens if they break and you can't find a unit that's exactly the same size and so forth. And I mean, I'll admit that one of the things that's made me cagey about smart home devices has been that I'm not sure that I want an iPad built into the front of my refrigerator.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like what does that mean? What does it know? Because it's also not that this is necessarily a dedicated firmware OS that only knows what it needs to know. It's probably a generic Android instance that has all the powers of any Android instance. It just happens to have a fridge UE slapped on the front of it.
And maybe a camera inside to tell you when you're out of eggs for some reason, right?
Yeah.
And I think like this is very much related to, I pulled up this pace layering kind of discussion that Stuart Brand keeps bringing up around, homes are basically trying to tear themselves apart most of the time. And what you're talking about is this idea that inside of the home, there's lots of changes that are happening constantly, right? And maybe the refrigerator is not changed all the time, right? But it's changed probably every decade. There's other things that are constantly changing, like the idea of a bookcase, right? Like what pictures are on the bookcase could be something that could change, overnight, right? Like my wife will put up pictures of people that are coming to visit, right? And it's like a signaling type of thing that we care about this person. But it's also important to say that this like inner loop inside of this pace layering diagram for the home is constantly changing. And so I think this is where like technology has not done the right thing from the standpoint that, what happens when a service no longer supports a particular device, right? Like there was a whole issue where Sonos was trying to brick kind of like decade-old devices that people had used for a very long time because they wanted to put them in like recycling mode. And this is the problem is like, I think, and this is kind of getting at maybe what I'm going to talk a little bit about at Assembly, is, how a lot of these services end up turning us into renters in our own home, right? And I think there does need to be the ability for us to change things, but we don't expect the walls of our home to change all the time, right? We expect the outer walls to change at a very slow rate. Things that are very inside, like what's on top of a counter or what's on a bookshelf, to change more rapidly. In the case of that like Android tablet that's on the outside of a fridge, like, yeah, that would be fine if it was there. Like I want displays everywhere. Like I think there's two trends in technology, right? Either things are coming closer to our faces and our brains, and eventually we'll be like, VR, Neuralink, all that type of craziness. But then the other side is that everything's being pushed out to the walls and becoming like ambient computing. And so, yeah, I do want my fridge to maybe have a device on it. I want it to be able to play music. I want a bunch of things because I want music in my kitchen, right? I want to be able to like write notes in my kitchen. I want to be able to have a bunch of things that are inside my kitchen, but I don't want to have to like update it all the time. I don't want to have to maintain that. And I don't want it to be bricked if for whatever reason, someone stops supporting that particular type of device. And that's, I think, the real issue around a lot of the smart home stuff is like, what happens when you actually move out of that house and you give it to someone else? Right. And that type of thing. So, I mean, and then we have to add in the fact that like your technology is just intermediating you and something else. And so all of this stuff is connected to third-party devices that are basically pushing data out of your home. So you're paying money out, you're getting services in, and then you're actually like pushing all of this data out to third-party services that you don't know what they're going to be doing with that data. In some cases, in the case of like Amazon, it's being sold, being sent to the police potentially without a warrant. There's third-party services that are collecting behavioral data to give you recommendation services or advertising. And so, yeah, I think that's the issue, right? Is like you don't have a lot of control, even though ideally it's not about the dichotomy of like private versus public. That's not how people think about privacy. They think about the control of the flow of information. I don't think people have the ability to do that today with most smart home devices.
Now, one of the, there was recently in the news that the Colorado utility, they had a heat wave, and so the Colorado utility took all of the smart devices that they could exert control over and locked the thermostats at 80 degrees. You couldn't turn it lower than that. And so there's a whole host, this is a Pandora's box of questions about, some of it's about sovereignty and ownership. Some of it's about, let's say you're running a cheese cave and all of your cheeses have spoiled because they got above 58 degrees.
Yeah.
This is to some extent ignoring the dynamic. I mean, if you did this in the South, for instance, where it's very humid, you have to keep thermostats low because you're using the air conditioner to dehumidify the air. And so you might be effectively moving electrical load later in the day by doing that kind of bounding, but you're not eliminating it because the air will have to be dehydrated again.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, let's be clear about that particular case too, because what's interesting about it is that those people actually opted into a program where they got, I think it was $100 initially, to basically be part of this energy saving, and then they get something like I think it's like a $25 a month discount to be part of this program. And that program, I mean, this is where I think it's really interesting. Yes, I agree with you. Like, if you have a cheese cave and you need to make sure that things are doing that, you should probably have a power wall. You should probably have solar. You should probably have all these things that take you out of control of, like, especially when we, nowadays, like, your power grid is way more likely to fail when, basically local governments have, and when I say local, I mean usually at the state level, may not have actually been doing a good job of, like, adjusting to, say, change in temperature. Right, like Texas, this happened in Texas with the whole cold thing that happened. But also in the case of, like, a heat wave, right, you should try to disengage. And I think, like, long term, like, if we think 100 years in the future, maybe every home has, like, a some type of fission, like a nuclear mini power plant, right, or every device does. So I think there's some interesting things there, but, like, from a speculative standpoint. But the truth is like, this is actually a cooperative problem as well, right? Because someone else I posted that article in the communal computing group, and there's, like, the response that I expected from everybody is what I got in there. But, like, one of the comments inside of that Tech Dirt article about it was like, which would you prefer, is adjusting people's thermostats that have opted into this type of program, or power rolling blackouts? And so this is like a tragedy of the commons type of issue, is like, how do you coordinate with other people when there's some type of shared resource? And so, yeah, I totally agree with you. Like, yeah, if you have a cheese cave, or you have, like, wine, or you have to dehumidify your rooms on a regular basis, right, you should consider how you actually detach yourself from these types of grids. But if you're dependent on these types of communal resources, how do you make these decisions is a really interesting and hard question, because I think what it ends up pointing to is that we are actually within a network and a complex graph of, like, interactions between people. And that's all that technology is, right? Is that technology is just intermediation between humans. And I think how we relate to it as, like, a power grid is one way. How we relate to it as, like, information, right? Like, another good example of this idea of, like, intermediation, I was actually thinking about it from the standpoint of, like, shifting of time and space is what technology does a lot. Like, my mom has a picture frame that I bought her. We're on the same picture frame service. I own the account that actually shows the pictures on either one of those places. And so it's a way for us to almost have, like, a shared, like, frame within our worlds, even though we live states apart. And I think it gets us into, how do we consider actually the community that we're part of in a more embedded way? And I think that story about the power adjustment, I think, talks about that, right? So anyways, I think it's, like, a really interesting problem, because you don't exist outside, like, unless you actually are, like, fully off the grid, right? And I'm sure there are Urbit people that are fully off the grid. You still, in some way, like, if you want internet, right, you want to connect to other people on Urbit, you have to be on some type of network. At least with, like, power, water, sewage, those types of things, you can actually get off the grid. But I don't know. I wonder, like, what is the communal aspect of these things ends up being outside of your home's walls as well, right? It's just that I think people made the wrong choices, and maybe we're actually not given the full information about the choices that they had when it came to this type of program.
$100
right?
is $100.
Yeah, it's $100, right? Like, I'm at $25 a month, right? Like, again, I don't know what the power prices are in Colorado, but, like, it's interesting, right? Like, so that's the question. It's like, maybe they should have made it clear, like, oh, do you prefer rolling blackouts, or do you want to have your thermostat adjusted? And you can get into all this thing about, like, how should this decision be made, right? Should it be one individual inside of a power company, or should it be some type of, like, again, consensus driven, consent driven. Like there's a bunch of different decision making models that are out there. But I think that's a really important question, right? And maybe they were not posed this question in quite the right way, and that's why they were surprised, right? Same thing with Texas, right? They've done a lot of work to make sure that Texas is their own grid, but that also means that it's less resilient when you have like state-specific weather patterns rather than the idea of being connected to a grid. And actually, there's a lot of really interesting work from like Santa Fe and the complexity theory kind of world about like tight coupling between systems actually leads to failure. So there is like an important aspect that we should have less tight coupling. It's like the idea of like a highly connected graph, right? And there's this in this world of like graph theory, there's like a click is basically a fully connected graph where every node is connected to every other node. And that's where you end up getting actually lots of failure cases. But there is this idea of like different levels of abstraction that you should have sparse connections between different at each level, essentially, so that you can build resilience and robustness in the network. But in the case of like, say, Texas with their power grid, right, like they've made it very specific that yes, probably if there is a nationwide failure, they will be not as impacted. But those are such like black swan events that it's very hard to plan for that. But weather, like state-specific weather, is much more common. So that's where I think they may have made a mistake when it comes to the way that they think about their power as like a connected or disconnected graph. So anyways, I'm sorry, I started like geek out on like graph theory about this type of thing, but there's something really important. Like if you look at like the 2008 crash, right, it was because there was like very tight coupling between all these levels of abstraction within the financial system. And when one perturbation happens inside that system, all of them start to fail because they're so tightly coupled. So I think that's what's like.
Yeah, and once you get to cascade,
yes,
then that's the thing that's very difficult to go back and try and control.
Well, and that's why like Urbit should not be fully connected, right? That's why like this idea of not even knowing the number of true communities that are out there is really good for Urbit, because the idea of cascading failures doesn't happen as much. And so you can have, like, you should have lots of small communities that are sparsely connected, because then it becomes a much more resilient and robust network.
We're recreating medieval Europe and its network.
Fiefdoms, yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you mentioned Urbit now, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about how does Urbit fit into this vision of communal computing that you've been working on putting forward here?
Yeah, and so this is something that I've been thinking a bit about, and so there's a couple different ways that Urbit could fit in the home, right? I've outlined kind of three main ones here. So the first one is maybe as a smart device, right? You could imagine that on a device that can run, like Raspberry Pi, like a door lock or a camera, or maybe even a light bulb, depending on like how powerful the computing is, Urbit could actually fit within one of those devices, and it would be something where maybe each one of those devices gets a moon, and there's a way that you control that identity. You end up doing onboarding and offboarding, or like in the IoT world, like the idea of instantiation of this particular device with your identity. Maybe it's as a device itself, right? So this goes back to the idea of the smart home assistant that's in my kitchen. Is the kitchen smart home device? There is some things too where people move devices around, so you have to think about like, how does that context change in some way? But I think that's one way that Urbit could fit. The second way is the idea of like the smart home hub, which is a lot of ways it's kind of like your core server within the home, right? It's the rack that you have in your closet of like, it's a way that you end up interfacing.
We all have server racks in our closets, right?
Exactly, as one does, right? We all have like data centers inside of our homes, basically. So that's another way I think it fits, is that this is the way that you like control all these different devices, and right now it's a fairly kind of fractured type of device set where some people are actually, some groups like Amazon, Google, they do this through like a smart home device usually. But there's new standards that are coming out by the CSA called Matter, which is a way to like have any hub or controller control any Matter device. And so there's kind of like a possibility there. And then finally, there's like the internet router, right? Which I think is really the gateway to a lot of homes. And I think this is interesting as like a place for Urbit, because longer term, you actually do want to control the flow of information that's going in and out of your home. And so, you could maybe buy the smart home like the bulb that is Urbit enabled to control it. But you could also maybe say that like the internet router, because you're not going to always like something that's happened since the beginning of time around smart home devices is that you do not control everything about these devices because they're made by lots of different manufacturers. And there's going to be some that you're going to buy that are very high end, right? Like you may care about your speakers, so you buy a Sonos or something like that. But then a lot of the stuff like the light switches, the light bulbs, they're going to start to trend towards commodity hardware, which is cheaper. It ends up being being made maybe not to last, right? So in that particular case, you can't ensure that it's an Urbit device. And so from that perspective, like you may want to control that gateway to the wider internet. I think where we're at right now, as far as like the way the grant ended up, my recommendation is to build basically kind of a hub. Like I think until Matter comes out, it's really hard because you have to integrate with every individual like device manufacturer that's out there. But once the Matter, like I think for now it's like, let's do a proof of concept, right? Let's figure out like how would people want to control their devices from Urbit, start to look at all these like small computer applications that people are working on, and how would that work as like inside the context of the home. And so I think that's really interesting to at least build a proof of concept. And that's my recommendation is like, let's build a proof of concept with one light bulb, because the Philips Hue light bulb is like the one thing that almost everybody had that I interviewed that had done smart home stuff. Now, the problem is that you still have to go to a third party and integrate with a third party to be able to like integrate with that. And that's like, there's a Philips service, there's a Philips identity that you have to like do. There's like a dev key and there's a bunch of stuff like that that you have to deal with. But I think that's like a good starting point. But long term, I think ideally Urbit is actually your internet router, right? Kind of like if we think about Urbit as like a heritage computer, it's something that is yours, that is part of your home, that you maybe move with you whenever you're moving places, but actually helps manage the home overall. And so I think that internet router side of the world is where you want to go long term from an Urbit standpoint.
Another technology that occurs to me in connection with this is, have you looked at the Sun Computing Sunray machines, the thin clients from about 20 years ago ever?
I mean, I know what you're talking about, but I mean, the idea of like, and yeah, so keep going. What do you mean by that?
I mean, just the idea that you have a lot of stateless devices that are contextually adapting as, you know, as a present identity configures itself.
Yeah, and I think this gets to, you know, some of the things that Urbit really thinks about as a principle standpoint is like the idea of calm computing. I think goes along with this. I guess I've been thinking about the idea of like slow setup, right? Like going back to that pace layering kind of thing is that there are certain aspects of your home that you maybe set up once, and then it's only when there's like a massive change that you actually alter them. So like the idea of that this is a bedroom / office now, and this furniture is in here, you don't change that very often. And so from that perspective, I think, yeah, there's some value in how do you kind of over time, you should be able to alter the systems that are in your home, just like you would change things that are in a bookcase or change what furniture is in a room. Problem is that all of these devices that you end up buying want you to like get to a completely set up state within the moment that you plug it in, right? Almost everything is about this idea of minimization of setup time to get you to quote unquote using the device, right? I think Urbit is really interesting because there's not engagement loops inside of it. And because there's no engagement loops, I think there's a real opportunity for, to your point about the thin client, like there should be all of these different things that are in your home that are enabled in the way that you want them to be enabled. And something that in like past lives, I've, you know, through building these types of like IoT or smart home devices, there's usually the adults that will do the setup. They'll use their account on there. They'll set it up the way they want to set it up. But then if you have someone that's like the tween age, right, like 11 to 13, they're technologically savvy and they're experimenting with a lot of things. And so basically they're the people that go into these devices and try out a lot of the functionality that the adults may not have tried out. And so they end up discovering a lot of things about these devices for both bad and good, right, for the adults. So there's something really interesting about this idea of like, as people become aware of new functionality, or as they discover new functionality, or as they need new functionality, they're able to actually evolve those things over time. And that's where I get the slow setup, is that setup is never done for a device, right? If you're really going to make something part of your like long-term life, it's always, you're always kind of like setting it up, or using it and altering the way you use it. It's the same thing with like how you end up deciding which apps are on your home screen of your phone, right? Or which websites are constantly being opened on your browser. These are things that like change over time, and they actually usually change based on like major life events. And so that was something that we heard. Yeah.
This is a very Stuart Brandian kind of approach here, right?
Yeah, totally.
Like he has in How Buildings Learn, right? He's making the point that I think somewhere I think this was in one of the things you'd linked about how you start a building but you never finish it.
That's right.
Right, like there's an ongoing process of accommodation.
Well, and this is like, you know, I know that maybe people at Urbit like to quote like Christopher Alexander an awful lot too, right? Is the concept of how people build things to be used by them. And actually this disengagement between the architect that would create the perfect, you know, like housing complex versus the way that I would build my hut originally for what I needed is very different. And yeah, I think like Christopher Alexander really kind of embodies this idea of like, how are you actually making your home yours, and how are you doing it in a way that enables the human things that you want to do, which could be like, you know, he talks about the idea of like, this view is beautiful, so we should actually build the kitchen window so that it has this view, because you're going to be sitting in there sometimes drinking coffee with your spouse or whoever and like pondering, right? And so I think this is where we need to do a better job of that with like the way we end up doing the slow setup of devices in our home, right? Whether they're thin or thick clients, they need to be able to alter and adapt to that type of thing. And so that's I think where we're not quite there yet. Like everything is very much about like super fast, like slam setup in the beginning. And then over time, like, yes, you can go and configure this again, but it's seen as like a failure by a lot of these teams based on their metrics if you have to like go back in and reset something up. And I think that's a mistake.
So do we get there by jailbreaking devices? Do we get there by
that's one way, yeah.
You know, convincing Philips and Google Home and all these others to adopt an Urbit compatible standard? You know, what's the road?
Well, I think that's why, like, in the study that we did in the grant as well, is we found, you know, again, it wasn't like a huge population of people. I think we ended up interviewing like 12 or 13 people. Half of them cared about where their data was going, and the other half did not. And so I think this is where like consumer choice comes in, is that I think for the people, and by the way, I think there was a really interesting aspect of this, which is more of like an intuition that I got out of interviewing these people. But once you start to actually live with other people, once you start to kind of segment or fracture your identity between like, say, work and home, or family, kids versus like your online identity, right? There's a number of identities that people take on, which I think I referenced this in a post, but like the number of passwords that you have stored in your browser, for example, I think the average is like 113. And so you have that many identities that are out there. You probably don't want all of them commingled. And so I think once you start to actually think about yourself in context with other people, and that's usually through a spouse or kids, you start to think about how you actually should have these different types of identities. And so I think there's maybe like an interesting kind of like you're growing up over time, and you change the way you think about your kind of relationship with third-party data. And so that's where I think long-term, it should be Urbit that actually controls the data flow, right? Which is something you can do today with Urbit, is you can, you know, all of your data is inside of Urbit. And there's a lot of things that we have to figure out like long-term about, like, if you have things like video storage somewhere, where does that go, right? Like those are still questions from the Urbit standpoint. But I think Urbit as like the router and as your home server, I think makes an awful lot of sense long-term. Now, you may not care about that until you start to actually cohabitate with other people. But I think that's really interesting. And from there, then I think we are actually able to do something which says like, how do we deal with these like identities within the home, and then go from there. So that's how I would think about it. It's like, you should have Urbit as the router. I think that's the right place for it, because you want it to be able to control it. Because again, you're not going to be able to always dictate how your devices act, because again, the fact that there's like in everybody's home, it's not like they have one manufacturer that has manufactured their stove, their refrigerator. Like everything that's in their home is not from one manufacturer, right? There's just like specialization that ends up happening. And so I don't think we can ever depend on everything being, Urbit in the home, because there's going to be other companies that are going to be building things. I think what you can talk about is like the choke point, which is your data pipe in and out of the home. I think is like a really important aspect of it. And maybe electricity too, right? Like there's some startups that are starting to go after like the electrical panel in your home as a way to actually control electrical use. And so the idea of like, most of the time people have dealt with their panel when they overload a circuit and they have to go in and like flip the switch again. But maybe that panel should also just like turn off certain plugs that don't need to be on, right? And so I think there's something about this idea of like control of your home is something that a lot of smart home devices are saying, but they're not necessarily doing it when it comes to the way that you interact with, or like, again, that time shifting and that space shifting happens with these third-party services as well. So yeah.
The rise of smartphones, and to some extent prior to that, tabbed computing, I think has made acute the problem of, it's a problem of context switching, but what's going on is that we have these devices around us that are playing a role in our extended cognition. But because they themselves don't have good contextual internal cues or barricades, it's sort of like you're always wandering into the global namespace when you do something. And so the structure of your attention is wrong as you work with these devices, because there's nothing to, you're working on a research project, digging into some particular idea, but there's nothing to stop you saying, oh yeah, I have a notification on my chess game and I'm going to go just do a move. Right. So you're like always losing context, losing attention.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in how do we make devices preserve and enhance the human ability to attend to tasks at hand. Yeah. And this does have a lot of overlap with smart home, and obviously goes like far beyond that. But getting things about the environmental cues correct is one of the ways that we can help this.
Yeah, and this was something that was like a complaint by a lot of people, is like video cameras or smart doorbells that have video cameras. They have the ability to kind of like trigger notifications, but they're not smart enough for it to be good notifications, right? Like the fact that a squirrel is running across my backyard is not a notification that I need to get like every single time that happens.
Unless you really like squirrels.
Well, yeah, I mean, hey, I'm not going to yuck someone's yum about squirrels, but like, honestly, it's one of those things where it's like, what is the human norm or the human need that we're trying to go after? And this is where like video doorbells, for example, like the reason why doorbells exist, right? And why they started to exist was because, someone is at your front door, you don't have direct view of your front door, they want to tell you that they're there. And that is actually an important notification, right? But if someone is like dropping off a package, how urgent is that notification? And so I think like this gets back to comm computing and the concepts that came out of like Xerox PARC in the 80s around comm computing is like, we don't need to have a notification for everything, right? And I mean, I know that was kind of like, I think that was one of the reasons why there wasn't like an Urbit app for a long time, right? Was like, do we actually want to have community notifications in a way? Because I turn off like, anything that I'm part of as far as like Slack or other types of messaging, things like that. Other than text messaging and phone, I actually turn off all those notifications because I will check it on a regular basis. That is good enough. And so I guess like when we start to think about the smart home, is it's like, what are the interfaces that we were used to as human beings, right? There was really interesting, there's this person that basically walks everywhere, right? And he did like a walk around the world. And he was talking about how kind of the human intuition around, if someone just like drives up, they're suddenly there at your doorstep. That's very different than seeing a stranger like a mile away starting to walk up to you. And so you're able to like ready yourself and, what is this person kind of like, what do they have with them? Are they a friend or an enemy? Like, do you know them or not? Like, a bunch of things like that I think are at the human scale that we keep on forgetting about, right? Like the fact that we're able to drive at like 80 miles an hour to get to someone's house is very different than the way I think our biology has really thought about the idea of like moving through space. And so it's almost like when you're doing like a video call, there may be some value in like seeing the person like slowly walking up. Like I believe a lot like long term in like video calling being like a main TV type of device thing. And the fact that someone can just like suddenly call, and like in the case of like Amazon, the idea of like drop in, and I think even Skype had something like this where you can just like automatically connect to a window in someone else's home. Like it would be like someone popping up in your window and like seeing inside your home, right? And that's weird. And that feels very odd because it's not at the human scale that we're talking about. And so I think there's something valuable about how do we like recenter around the way humans biologically are surprised or interested or end up forming connections, and then using that as a way to like actually infer the way we build these types of interfaces or notifications, right? Like the fact that someone has walked up to my door, that's an important notification, right?
I'm imagining starting developer calls like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, where I like walk in and
exactly.
Sweater up.
Exactly, and that's why that's so calming, right? Is because like it's like, hey, we're I'm not just going to walk in here and like start talking at you and like babbling, right? But I'm going to walk in, I'm going to take my shoes off, I'm going to change my shoes, I'm going to put on my inside sweater, and we're going to have a conversation. Like I'm going to make coffee for you. We're going to like, the clatch like type of thing is like, how are we now getting used to each other in the same space and then doing what we need to do, versus the idea of like a lot of video calls. The reason why they feel so impersonal is it's like, let's get to it right now, right? Rather than the way that we actually meet and there's still like small talk in video calls, of course. And that's like one of those normalization things. But there's this whole idea of like social presence, right? And so I think when we talk about this idea of like time shifting and space shifting, social presence is this idea of like, how am I, thinking, like basically not thinking that you're remote, and how much does it actually feel like we're in the same room together? And so a lot of video calling, the reason why things like resolution, frame rate, lag, even syncing between audio and video ends up having like a really detrimental effect to the way that we end up doing these video calls. And that's why like, places like Facebook are trying to go after like VR meetings, even though they're super awkward and people don't have feet and stuff like that. Like there is actually, and I've tried out like Workplace, which is a Facebook product. They have like VR meetings now. And I've tried that out a couple times. And the fact that like the mouth is moving in the VR world and they're tilting their head, there's even like eye tracking, and even just the idea of like turning your body to someone, there is actually a benefit to that. Now it's still like horrifically horrible, like, like me type of like weirdness to it. But there's something that's interesting about it because
I'm imagining Lawnmower Man.
That is a great VR movie. And yeah, so like exactly like that, right? Like it's still kind of weird. And that's why you have to go like cartoonish for a lot of the stuff, because there's still that uncanny valley. I mean, what scares me is like, why did the uncanny valley effect actually start? That means that there was something that was like humans but wasn't humans. And that really freaks me out. And so, I mean, like just biologically, like why do we have
the psych of
I mean, that's like a horrifying thought, is like, what was like our Neanderthal time frame where it was like us but not like us, that we had to like have that effect, right? And so but there's something, I mean, that's the interesting thing, right, is like we actually anthropomorphize a lot of stuff. So we're constantly trying to find like faces and imagery. And this is why like I think the Turing test is like a horrible way to like actually, if we want to get into like machine learning, to actually try to decide whether something's intelligent, because we're easily fooled. Right? Like we're constantly trying to, in some way, like, actually think of this thing as a device. And I mean, this gets to like the idea of theory of mind and how we end up actually like coordinating with other people. And, we build theory of mind, which is, I think, like tightly related to the different Dunbar numbers that are there. Is the Dunbar numbers like from like your family to like your group of friends to everybody you know to like your entire village or your city, like that spectrum is about how well you know that person and how well you model their brains inside your brain. And there have been a lot of people that like even, the idea of like people will name their Roombas, right? Or there are soldiers that have had like funerals for their bomb disposal units, right? And people start to think like people that use metal lathes all the time, they can hear when the metal lathe is not working correctly, right? So they build these models about the way things work, and we're personifying them all the time. And so, I think that's why I think like, well, one, just maybe at the very high level, Turing test is a bad way to do that, but it's something we do, right? And it's something that when we think about our home, we may, sometimes people think of their homes like the idea of like people that think their homes are haunted, right? It's like it's a personification of their home in some way. And so like when the home groans this way, it means that there's wind outside, right? And so these are all things that we're like trying to do pattern matching when it comes to being a human being in relating to our environment. It's just that we happen to also like over-index on the fact that like, is this a human or not? So because we're highly social, right? Like that's the most important thing, is that we're highly social. And there was another really interesting study, not to like go out too far off track, but there was a really interesting study just reading about how, and this is like as far back as like 2011, but like all the biases that we end up having as individuals, like the thinking fast and slow Kahneman type of thing, like all those biases that we end up having, or kind of like cognitive impairments because we're doing like fast decision making, are actually fixed in group dynamics. And so there's been a lot of studies where like there's this one cognitive task where people get right only like 20% of the time as an individual. But in some of the studies, they've then shown that like it flips when you're in a group, where you get it 80% right when we're in a group. And so anyways, I think this just like goes to the point that like all technology is about intermediating humans. And I think that's something that when we think about our smart home, the smart home is no longer just the people that are physically there, but also the people that are being time or space shifted away from us in some way.
This also evokes to me the Dynamic Land project and turning the physical artifacts around you into explicitly computational devices.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's super interesting because, the interfaces by which we interact with our world, like even though they're physical, we may still assign intelligence to them. Like there's a whole field around animism that I think is really interesting, and not just from like, there's the idea of the religious concept of animism is like Shintoism, First Nation, and like some types of Hinduism all believe that everything has like a spirit inside. And actually maybe this is connected to like panpsychism or unconsciousness, but there's this idea that like we do this because we're actually trying to personify our interaction with something, and that could be inanimate or animate. And so that's like the idea of like the trickster fox, right? The trickster fox is interesting to us because it helps us actually understand how we should deal with foxes. And I think there's actually a relationship to the way that we start to consider the devices in our home, that everything could be interacted with. Now, this is where I think like, what should a lamp be like though, is a really important question. Like probably a lamp should not be able to talk to me, right? Like I should be able to talk to a lamp. I should be able to have it turn on and off, but like, I don't want every device in my home talking to me.
You know the meme, right? You are a computer. You do not talk to me.
Exactly. Well, and would a lamp do that though? Right? A lamp would be able to flicker its light, be able to change the color of its light, the luminosity, like all these things that a lamp should do, but it's not talk to me, right? The only things that should talk to me are pretty rare, actually. And I think like when we start talking about like the long-term around voice interfaces, it's much less about like specifically, like everything is talking to you in the home. Even the idea of like the home as a voice, I still think is maybe not a lot. I mean, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether that is actually an interaction modality that we want. We want to talk to the home, we want the home to react, but do we want the home to always say something to us, right? I think is a really good question. So like the lamp should be able to blink at me, and I should be able to tell it to turn on or off. And it should try to sense the context in the room, that it doesn't like automatically turn things off when people are sitting there, right? So there's a bunch of like interesting things. And just maybe tying that back to animism is like, what is my mental model about a lamp? And I think there's like some really interesting questions inside of that.
All right, we are 5 minutes to the hour, so we should address before we turn to the next meeting of what's next for the communal computing project with respect to Urbit.
Yeah, so right now I put a draft grant inside of the white paper if people want to check that out. I am looking for like a Hoon developer to help write some of the like the Gall app and a few other things to interact between Urbit and a smart light bulb just as a test case. And so that's something I'm looking for, is someone to partner with around this. I mean, my background ends up being a lot around like user experience, user research, product management. And so I'm looking to partner with someone where we definitely need help to like write this stuff, but then a lot of it will end up being like seeing how Urbit people actually use this in the context of their home, and does it fit, does it not, right? Because I think there's a lot of very open questions about what is the right thing to do when it comes to Urbit in the home. And so there's still an awful lot to learn, right? So that's kind of next step, is to put in another grant proposal that is focused on a very specific proof of concept around basically smart home control for a light bulb, but then building it in such a way that like long-term, we can start to have like other smart light bulb, other types of devices. And then whenever the CSA actually launches the hub or controller standard for Matter, which should be later this year, I think that's like the next grant after this, is actually to make Urbit a smart home controller. And so, yeah, so like basically I'm going to be talking on the community stage at Assembly next week. Still figuring out the day, but like want to talk about the particular talk I'm going to be talking about there is actually around kind of how lockout or like a renter's mentality starts to happen with the way that these business models for smart home devices are actually created. Like TV manufacturers in some cases are making as much money selling TVs as they are selling your data. And so, I mean, I think there's something very interesting about how Urbit can position itself as the way that you end up controlling these types of smart home devices in a very deep way. And so that will be my talk like at Assembly. But that's what kind of next steps is, another grant to do a proof of concept, and then, you know, kind of continuing this like discourse around what is the right way to have like a smart home that you control in some way.
All right, fantastic. Let's adjourn here and meet at the Hangout afterwards. It's in the comments on YouTube up channel as well, in case you don't see it before we close here. So we'll see you all in a few minutes.
All right,
Thank you, Pilwyc.